This is looking at Ted Hughes' poem Relic. And before we start, it would be really good if you could get a clean copy of the poem. There's one on the screen if you want to screenshot it. Otherwise, it's available online. And just have a read through of it yourself. What you're aiming to do in that first read through is to try and work out your initial ideas and impressions. So what you think about it, what you think the story of the poem is, what you'd start to pick out as being particularly interesting. Now you can see that on my clean copy, I've put 3 different pictures. The first one, once you've read the poem, should be pretty self-explanatory, and the other 2 we're going to deal with as we go through. So what I'm going to do now is just switch to my kind of annotated copy that I've put some ideas on. But as we go through this, I'm also going to add in some other annotation, which I will do in turquoise, so you can see it appearing. So at this point, I'm going to assume that you have read the poem and had some thoughts about it, and maybe that you've looked up some words that you weren't sure about. I think most people probably need to check on camaraderie, and camaraderie, and that is at the final line of the first stanza. If you think not only of friendship and kind of loyalty to those friends, but also it has connotations of being bonded over some sort of adverse experience. So where you tend to get camaraderie is this idea of maybe soldiers on the battlefield or people who've gone through some intense negative experience, but it's bonded them together. Right? So camaraderie is that kind of sense of friendship, often born out of adversity. And then second stanza, final line in that list, we've got carapaces. And a carapace is any hard sort of shell bit of an animal. So if you think Hughes there is listing the bits that remain, the bits that tend to get washed up. And then just vocab-wise, I think, cenotaph, at the final line of the poem, I've put a picture down there of the cenotaph in London, but the term cenotaph generically is a memorial kind of statue or kind of column or some physical thing that is memorializing deaths. But what marks it out is that generally with cenotaphs, the bodies tend not to be at the memorial. So you will maybe see how that works as we go through the poem. So first of all, looking at the title, I would always try and think of the title before you get started and then revisit it once you've had a read of the poem, just because you're going to come up not only with the expectations the poem's title is established, but whether or not the poem itself confirms those expectations or subverts them in any way. So when I hear the word relic, I think of something to do with history, a physical thing, something that's been left over from the past. So connotations wise, I've got this idea of something historical, but then I look at the kind of original meanings of it, and relics were generally kind of associated with religious belief, and they tended to be physical reminders of faith. And very often they were body parts or they were kind of fragments of something. So the early kind of medieval relics would be things like finger bones that were meant to be from the hands of Saint Peter, or splinters that were said to be from the cross, etc. If you ever study that period of history, you'll realize that there was a great line in fraud being done, and Saint Peter probably would have had hundreds of fingers if all of the bones would have been put together, but they were relics. So it was something to be revered. Okay, it had that kind of religious feeling about it. There's also this kind of feeling of something that's come from a bygone age, something that's arguably obsolete or at least outmoded. So this thing that's had its day, that has now passed into an object of sort of curiosity, at least kind of it is no longer useful, and that becomes relevant to the poem. So if we look at the story then next, and it's really important to get the story sorted out in your own head, because then you can make sure that everything that you're saying is consistent with that context. right? Because we're not going to rip kind of words or phrases out of the context of the poem. Our interpretation needs to fit in with that greater whole. So here we have a first person speaker who is taking a moment on a beach to reflect, finding this jawbone, and is using that as a way into considering things like the brutality of nature, the passage of time, the inevitability of death and the cycles of life. You know, he's using this idea of the jawbone to really start thinking about, okay, what eats will at some point be eaten, and the bits will be kind of spat out, discarded. Death will come to everything. Cheery poem, but dealing with one of those big themes of life and literature. So I found this jawbone at the sea's edge. Okay, and I've kind of made the little note here that you may or may not have come across this phrase, liminal space. Okay, liminality or liminal means to do with transition or borderline or being on a kind of halfway point. Okay, it's almost like you're standing at a doorway, you're not quite in either room. And here the sea has got that feeling of, you know, being this other world, this world of brutality and harsh coldness, but that it throws up these pieces into the human world. And when it's done with those things, you know, it kind of discards them. So I found this jawbone at the sea's edge. So I'd argue that the beach becomes a liminal space, a space which is the kind of transition point between the human world and that harsh natural world. And the sea has discarded this jawbone there. We've maybe got that sense of kind of, I suppose, a barrier. We can't get to it by that colon, that end stop. And the first person speaker here reflects that their crabs, dogfish broken by the breakers or tossed to flap for half an hour and turn to a crust, continue the beginning. Right? I'm reading down to try and get sense units. Okay, so you can see here, I've read to that full stop because I want to make sure that I get the whole sense of the sentence, and then I can look at things like line breaks, I can look at ambiguity, I can look at kind of breaking up the meanings. But literally we're saying, you know, on this beach there are all sorts of the bodies of things. I mean, if you've ever been to a beach and seen what gets washed up, it's quite common to find little kind of crab shells, crab legs, etc. Dogfish are kind of sharky. They have very leathery, very kind of rough skin, and if they're washed up they tend to last for a while. Okay, so they're not like if you see, you know, a kind of trout or something in fresh water, the skin is very soft, you know, it kind of would come off, it would rot down quickly. Dogfish are much more leathery and enduring. Okay, so these dogfish have been broken by the breakers. So we look and we see this breakers. If you think of where you're on the beach and there is a point where the waves kind of fall over themselves, you know, it's the point that the surfers would be interested in, the point where they kind of turn into white tops. The waves break, they fall over themselves. And that is the point of the breakers. Okay, so you can be, you know, in front of the breakers or past the breakers. But here it's that line, and calling them breakers emphasizes the destruction there, you know, this violence of the sea. You also get the idea that, you know, these bodies are broken by the breakers. We know that breakers are what we call waves that break, but this idea is a kind of pun. It gives this additional meaning that these waves exist for the purposes of breaking. Okay, so the breakers break things. They don't just break themselves. And their job is to break these bodies before they reach the kind of beach, before they reach our perception. Now you can see here, I've underlined the plosive alliteration here. And you'll remember that plosive alliteration is P's, B's, and D's largely. It's anything where your mouth is kind of going through it, and it usually suggests a kind of violence or force. Okay, so we've got the violence or force there, and there's this little technical term here, polyleptoton, and polyleptoton is where you're using the same kind of root but in different forms of the word. So, you know, it might be when you get a noun and an adjective, or a noun and a verb or so. But here we've got broken by the breakers. So it's playing with this to break. So I guess you could say that the polyleptaton there is suggesting the varieties of different kind of violence that these bodies are experiencing. So they're broken by the breakers or tossed to flap for half an hour. Okay, so tossed we know means kind of to throw carelessly, and the enjambment there gives that kind of a sense of opening out. You know, they're thrown, they hang for a moment, but we know because it's enjambed, we kind of have to keep reading. So tossed to flap for half an hour. And I guess I've put here in very bad handwriting, it's the undignified kind of nature of it. These have been discarded, you know, they are tossed and they flap. These are the bodies of these fish that kind of aren't quite dead. They're going to kind of die on the shore, but they're kind of, the remainder of their life is short, half an hour. And then they turn to a crust to continue the beginning. So the idea that these bodies sort of paradoxically, and a paradox is where you have something that seems not to make sense, but then when you look at it more closely, you think, oh, okay, yes, it does, if you look at it like that. You know, the end of these fish, the end of these lives is the beginning of something else, because it's the beginning of the process where they turn to a crust to continue the beginning in terms of the next stage of what they're doing to continue this cycle. Because we know that these bits of creatures washed up on the shore, you know, their bones, their shells and things are going to add to the sand. They're going to join the food chain. You know, they are going to kind of play their part. After this caesura, okay, so picking out that full stop as a caesura, the focus changes and we're kind of directed into the sea, directed back to where these creatures have come from. So where this jawbone has lived, the deeps are cold. Okay, and this is a kind of monosyllabic, okay, monosyllabic words of one syllable, okay, emphasizing both the literal and the metaphorical, the emotional coldness of those waters, the idea that the depth of it is distant, the coldness is unforgiving, right? And you know, we have in that darkness, we can almost link it with, you know, this jawbone, that darkness, this phatic language. But in that darkness, camaraderie does not hold. Okay, so we've got the harsh K of the darkness there, the kind of connotations of the unknown, the mysterious, and the idea that this loyalty, this friendship doesn't hold, doesn't mean anything. You know, these creatures are very much living lives of kind of individual struggles for survival. And we can notice that here we've got this rhyming couplet at the end. Previously it's been free verse, okay, but we have two of these rhyming couplets, and this kind of sense of pronouncement, finality. Okay, rhyming couplets generally are pretty good at making connection and decision. So always think, okay, what is this couplet doing? And here it's kind of got that announcement that yes, you can't rely on it. It is stark, it is harsh, right? We then move to the next stanza, which is one line longer. Okay, so again, we can think of what are we doing here with form. We've got 5 lines and then 6 lines, so a quintain, then a sestet. And then we go back to a quintain. And it could even be that, you know, that form is suggesting the kind of ebb and flow of the sea. Okay, because we go short, longer, shorter, right? So there's that kind of pulsing sense to it. But we start with our next line, nothing touches but clutching devours. Loads of great stuff in there, because nothing touches. I mean, you know, nothing is touching you. You are touching nothing. There is no touch. There is no tactile contact, okay? Tactile to do with being touched. But also, you know, the nothingness touches could be an underlying meaning there. This idea of, you know, being touched by the void, but clutching devours. So we have this kind of sentiment that nothing touches you except for when it grips you to eat you. right, is what we've got. And we can talk about the connotations of devouring. It's not just eating, it's eating with this extreme kind of hunger, this extreme appetite. And we have the kind of, again, the ideas of clutching is the desperation in that grip. So nothing touches but clutching, that internal rhyme there, and the assonance, so that repetition of the vowel sound, kind of gets the strength and the determination and the grip, right? And nothing touches but clutching devours. We can talk about the caesura round that clutching to kind of emphasize the brutality of it, the kind of grasp, I guess, that is all that's going on if you are grabbed. Right? But then we get this conjunction and the jaws, okay, because our focus is going to be on these jaws. And this is an example of synecdoche, okay? If you cannot remember the fancy word synecdoche, or indeed the spelling of it, all you need to do is say that, you know, the jaws are being used as a symbol for the whole creature, for the whole fish. And synecdoche is where you have one part of the thing which is being used to symbolize the whole thing. Right? So our focus on this fish is now that it is jaws. Okay, and if you think of what jaws do, this idea of biting, ripping, consuming, eating, the fish is reduced to that purpose, because the jaws, before they are satisfied or their stretch purpose slacken, go down jaws, go gnawn bare. And kind of unpicking that, you know, we've got the idea of the jaws before they've finished, or before they slacken off, they loosen off, they go down as jaws, and they themselves are gnawn, to gnaw, they're eaten down bare. So the jaws kind of are both eating and facing being eaten, or at least kind of picked off, having the flesh picked off them, ironically being reduced to just jaws now when the rest of the fish is eaten. We've got this idea of satisfaction. You know, if your appetite is satisfied, you've had enough, but also you can be psychologically satisfied. You can be mentally kind of satisfied that, yes, that is good enough. And there's the implication that, you know, these jaws are never going to be satisfied before they can be satisfied, or before they can kind of slacken off, before they can kind of loosen off, before they can step back from what they're doing. They will be themselves gnawn bare. Again, we've got this internal rhyme, jaws, gnawn, and the idea that Hughes rhymes jaws with jaws here. Really, that focus is on this fish as a kind of eating machine, if you like. The idea that their stretched purpose is just to consume. And I've just picked up the idea of this stretching being both a kind of physical action and, you know, when you challenge yourself, the fish's entire effort is going into eating. So despite the existence of this fish and despite its purpose, and Hughes talks about its purpose later, it will still face this inevitable death, this inevitable reduction to what's going to happen to it. So jaws eat and are finished. So again, that idea of finished being, you know, the meal being finished, and then the end of the fish's life, or the end of the creature's life, because they are then done, right? And the jawbone comes to the beach. And I've put this idea of autonomy there. So if you are autonomous, you are independent, you are functioning by yourself, okay? Useful word, automaton, is a kind of clockwork machine that just, it's like wind it up and watch it go, it just functions. Okay, so if you call somebody an automaton, you are basically calling them a mindless robot. If you are saying, I want my autonomy, you're saying, I want my independence. So it's an interesting one because it can have both positive and negative connotations. If you're interested in automata, I really recommend that you do this. Look up the Bowes Museum Silver Swan. That is one of the best examples of an automaton. And if you can imagine seeing that before electricity and before kind of all the technology we've got, you can see how mind-blowing it would have been for the people in the 1700s. Okay, so back to jaws rather than swans. So the jawbone almost makes that decision to come to the beach. It almost has this kind of autonomy of itself. And, you know, again, there's these end stops, these colons being used in terms of, you know, possibility. I guess. And I don't think it's an accident that we've got the beach there and the sea's edge up here. Both of them have that colon end stop, almost kind of introducing you, almost kind of leaving that open. And then this is the sea's achievement. Okay, so the personification of the sea now. What has the sea achieved? Well, the sea has achieved the fact that the jawbone comes to the beach. You know, we've got this space, which is kind of this borderline between the sea and the human world. But the sea is winning here. The sea has kind of done all the work because it has shells, vertebrae, claws, carapaces, skulls. So there's this listing. If you want to call it a syndectic listing, you can do that. Just means listing with commas rather than polysyndectic listing, which is listing with conjunctions, usually and. But we have this list of the bits. Okay, these animals are reduced to kind of backbones, claws, shells, skulls, right? And the kind of harshness of the consonant k there, the claws, carapaces, skulls, and the end stop. You know, these creatures are now fragmented. They are pieces of what they were, but in becoming those pieces, they have now taken their place within this wider natural picture. Now, the next stanza, we're back to our quintain again. Time in the sea eats its tail. And this is why we have this picture of this snake here. That image is called the Arubus. And it is an image which symbolizes eternity, infinity, and things that are cyclic, going in circles, in cycles. Because you can see that, you know, there is no end to it in this kind of figure eight shape. And time in the sea eats its tail means that actually time in the sea becomes a kind of Arubus. So we have this idea of, you know, infinity. We have this idea of endless consumption, I guess, that it's just going to keep going. And that the idea that time itself in the sea becomes one of these monsters, becomes one of these creatures, because they're all kind of working together. So time eats its tail and it thrives, and time casts these indigestibles far from the surface. We'll look at that little bit in a moment. But, you know, it's the sea and time working together. There is this kind of symbiotic relationship. Symbiosis is where, you know, you have two things that are equally reliant on each other to survive. And time in the sea throws these indigestible things, these bits that can't be eaten, this list of the leftover hard stuff. And again, we have this idea of casting. Casting is throwing, that tossing of earlier, throwing it onto the beach, but also casting to kind of create, almost in, you know, if you think of cast iron, or if you think of, you know, a mold, you cast something in a mold. So this is kind of interesting because it's both indicative of destruction and throwing something away, and also has those undertones of creation and repurposing to it. Okay, because, and they get thrown onto the beach, they get thrown onto this space where they're going to continue the beginning. Spars here means kind of masts. You know, it's these signs, these bits that are sticking up, but they are the kind of symbols of purposes that failed. Okay, so, you know, these lives, these points, these challenges that these animals have, their purposes failed. They died. They failed far from the surface. So, you know, those purposes, they died in the deeps, in those kind of unemotional, unsympathetic deeps that the poem talks about earlier. But you can also read this as the spars of purposes that failed far from the surface, relating to the casting. Okay, so, you know, it casts them far from the surface. So, you know, it throws them right up onto the beach. So we have this idea that time and the sea are really powerful and are kind of dealing with these remnants, these relics of the lives and the struggles there. Non-grow rich, really interesting line break there. That enjambment takes us to non-grow rich in the sea, but non-grow rich, it's a kind of nihilistic viewpoint. This, if you think of annihilate or nihilism, it's that idea of kind of, well, it's all pointless, isn't it? non-grow rich, nothing's going to succeed. There's no success there in the sea. This curved jawbone did not laugh. So that idea of there's no happiness, there's no enjoyment, it's emphasizing that brutality again. And again, the synecdoche, taking it down to the whole fish. The jawbone didn't laugh, but gripped. So that repetition, that strong plosive there, the guttural G, the plosive on the D, I suppose an element of internal rhyming gripped and gripped. But the jawbone is now a cenotaph. So laugh and cenotaph, we've got that rhyming couplet. Again, that sense of finality from the rhyming couplet. And if we think about what we said at the start in terms of cenotaph is this memorial, a physical memorial, where the body is elsewhere, you can see that actually it becomes really pertinent here, really relevant, because the jawbone is acting as a memorial for the rest of the fish, because the rest of the fish is lost to the sea. You've got a lot of ideas in there. Obviously, it's free verse. We've talked about the form kind of ebbing and flowing. I definitely pick up on the rhyming couplets and the internal rhyme, not least because it makes it really satisfying to read. The idea of nothing touches but clutching devours. You can look at some of the enjambment in there. There's quite a lot of enjambed lines which kind of keep you flowing again, like kind of the waves, the breakers there that are going backwards and forwards. The pauses by the caesura, those moments of reflection, those moments of kind of stopping you. If you're going to talk about specific caesura, think about what's gone before, what is there in the future that you're just taking a moment before you introduce that. I really like this poem. And it's quite unforgiving, really, as a view of the world. If you were talking about this in terms of the themes and things, I would be talking about the harsh reality of the sea, harsh reality, brutality of nature, talking about natural cycles, talking about the circle of life without sounding too much like you're in The Lion King. But also, I wonder about humanity's place within that, because with the exception of the speaker mentioning himself as the first word, the rest of it is kind of reflection on this other situation, this other world. So is this kind of talking about humanity's place within that circle of life, or is it this kind of moment of slightly distant reflection of a world in the sea that we can't quite understand? Or can it be both? My thinking is usually that it can be both. Okay, I hope this helps. If you are studying this for GCSE, then look at what you need to do with it. If you are writing about it in isolation, I would consolidate your notes so you've got your kind of main points. Don't forget to put things in that are specifically form and structure. And the best way of doing it is to really use that subject terminology to make your expression nice and concise and to bolster up the effects you're talking about. Okay, so the effects are the big thing. Subject terminology is great to support it, and try and say a lot about a little. So if you're talking about a quotation, try and add something in, not only about the connotations or the metaphor or the simile, but try and add something in to do with the alliteration or the assonance or the consonants or the caesura or the enjambment or the end stopping or the internal rhyme or so. Build up those points to layer them. Okay, I hope this has helped. Good luck with your studies.